Welcome to the Sacred Thread podcast, where we explore spirituality, psychology, and the deeper questions of what it means to be human. I'm your host, Winston Janis. Hey everybody, thanks for listening again to the Sacred Thread podcast. I'm here today with Jory Pryor, who is a fellow podcaster, author. He was the host of the Methods podcast, and recently, I became aware of his book, Becoming All Light, the Nondual Heart of Christianity. So we've got a lot of common interests, and I thought we would have a good conversation today. Thanks for joining me, Jory.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. It's been a while. It's been too long.
Yeah, we were saying it's hard to believe, but we first connected roughly 5 years ago, I think. So a lot has happened since then. But yeah, I like I said, I saw you on Instagram, and I've been kind of doing some posting on different platforms, and said, hey, we should reconnect. I know we have a lot of these kind of common interests, and when I was talking with Thomas J. Ord, your name came up as well, and I think that's where I first became aware of this book. How long ago did this come out again? Remind me.
Think I think I put it out at the beginning of 23, maybe end of 23.
Okay.
I could be off on that. I don't know. I'm terrible with time. But yeah, I think it was around maybe the end of 23. So it's still sort of fresh, but um, I people sometimes will send me a quote and I'm like, "Oh, cool, who said that?" And they're like, "You." I don't remember, but if you say so.
Yeah, well, honestly, like I said, I wish I had gotten to spend more time with the book before our conversation today. But I have been reading it, and I think it's beautifully written. And yeah, I think you're a talented writer. Honestly, I'm not just saying that, and I'm looking forward to hopefully reading through the whole thing. Um, yeah, it's fascinating, and uh, you mentioned it's kind of interesting at the beginning, like in the introduction, you were saying like, did this book need to be written? Not necessarily. You're kind of talking about how there are so many other brilliant authors and people who have said it all before. I can kind of, as a fellow also writer and somebody that's trying to put this message out into the world and talk about spirituality and religion, I can relate to that feeling like everybody's already said it all before. What can
Mhm,
I possibly contribute to that, right?
mm,
But I think you said it really well. That's like it's the one uses the chorus of voices of all of us. And I mean, I'm just saying, like, for me, right, it can feel sometimes a little lonely on this journey, like finding voices that resonate on a deep level. And you read the same old guys, and it's like they're amazing, or women, right? Uh but then you do get hungry for like refreshing voices, to hear the same truths expressed in new and fresh ways, right?
mm,
Like, I think I saw somebody post say like, yeah, it's all been said before, but not by you, right? Kind of thing.
mm.
So go ahead and say it. So I've been appreciating reading a kind of a fresh voice, even if it is maybe some of the same ideas. I still get excited about reading you say it,
Mm.
does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And even I like the Emily Dickinson quote of tell the truth, but tell it slant.
Mm.
Like tell it with your own flavor. And even if you're saying the same thing, because of your own life experience and your own conditioning, it's going to take on a fresh character, whether you want to whether you try to make it new or different or whatever, it's going to naturally come out new and different because who we are moment to moment is new and different.
Right.
And it's like I think about sometimes when someone's not hearing something. Like I think about like situations at work where somebody says something and the other person just kind of ignores it or is like, yeah, 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 whatever. And then it just takes the right person to say the thing. And sometimes that's the boss, or sometimes that's not the boss. Sometimes that's a, a coworker or whatever that, or in a family situation, sometimes it's a mother that has to say something, even if the father said the exact same thing. But just the way that it's delivered and the energy with it's delivered, um, can not necessarily provide new information, but it can allow the person hearing it to hear it on a deeper level. So, and I
Oh,
think it's like that with everyone. And there's so many voices of discord and so much noise present in the world today that even if you think you are saying the same thing as someone else, please, if it's something good to say it, because we need more voices of harmony and than voices of discord.
yeah.
Yeah.
Amen to that. That's true. I do think that sometimes, I know this is kind of as a therapist too, right? As any kind of teacher probably knows that sometimes a person needs to hear it 100 different times in 100 different ways before it finally clicks or sinks in, right? Um, yeah, so there's a lot of truth to that. But I'm wondering, so with this book, maybe for those that are unfamiliar, I mean, what is like the core message of the book? What were you trying to accomplish with it?
Well, I think I mentioned in the first part of the book that, it was really a spiritual practice and exercise for me to write it because again, not because I thought it needed to be written or needed to come from me or anything, but specifically in the tradition of Advaita Vedanta, which I've been studying for some years. Part of the sadhana, the spiritual practice, um, is to teach others what you would want to know, or what you're trying to learn and trying to um, make real in your own experience. And so, and it follows through with anything in this world. If you want to learn something, teach it to someone,
Hmm.
because the very process of teaching something in some way that I'm not familiar with brain science and cognitive science, it does something to allow you to internalize that information and that modality in a way that just learning it in a rote way does not. Teaching it actually allows you to enter more deeply into it. So that's part of the actual spiritual practice in my tradition. Um, we're meant to share the truth with others in a way that helps us learn it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's definitely the things that I can attest to that in my own experience as well. So becoming all light. Uh, how did you come upon that title?
Well, let me see if I remember. Um, so in the Christian tradition, so I kind of set up the book by looking at the Neoplatonic influenced tradition of patristic Christianity and the Desert Fathers and Mothers and the kind of genealogy of the word contemplation and the quote unquote mystical side of Christianity, in a way that's not necessarily woo woo, but in a way that's, I think, hopefully true to the tradition itself, even if it's not a scholarly exposition at all. Uh, However, one of the things that's present in that tradition is this kind of threefold path of purgation, illumination, and union. Um, and how that gets received in modern parlance is, we're receiving this like illuminating light of God, um, or even the kind of more contemporary and Eastern influenced term of, enlightenment. This it has this kind of connotation of like, we are receiving this illumination and we're being illumined by something, that there's this secondary source of illumination that's outside of us. And what I think you find if you actually look more deeply into the tradition, um, and then especially influenced by my study of Advaita Vedanta, and then reading that back in a comparative and interreligious kind of way into the scriptures. um, I think I say in there that it's not enough to become, if we're taking the depth of the spiritual path as outlined by some of the most hardcore mystics of the tradition of Christianity, Meister Eckhart, Marguerite Porete, um, Nicholas of Cusa. Um, there's so many, but they all kind of center around this idea that it's not enough to become illumined, but that in the process of illumination, um, we become that light. We become that light with which we are illumined. And so there's this aspect of non-duality that's present within the deepest components of Christian theology and of Christian practice. And that's not always the most explicit, because it's a tradition that's very devotionally oriented, that's very um, practically oriented a lot of times, with service to the poor. Um, and it's predicated a lot of times on this division between us and you know the figure of Christ, or us and God, or us and the Holy Spirit, or however you want to frame it. And so the mystics, I think, one, experienced uh, God in that way, in that dualistic way, but then a lot of times also were able to experience God in a non-dualistic way as well. They just had to be careful with how they worded that a lot of times, because it was, could be seen as heresy, as, some people were burned at the stake for that kind of thing. Luckily, Meister Eckhart was able to make it out unscathed, because he was, I think, uh, a gifted interlocutor that could kind of argue his own case well. But unfortunately, a lot of other people, including women, were not as fortunate, and were actually like literally set on fire while they were alive for this realization. And so the purpose of the book, I think, is to highlight that there's the heights of non-duality that are present in traditions like Advaita Vedanta or Dzogchen Buddhism, Mahamudra. um, that same level of realization is present within the Christian tradition, within the Christian corpus, um, but it has to be read in a way that's um, maybe more open and charitable.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I imagine maybe some of my listeners are familiar with this whole idea or concept of non-duality, but maybe some aren't. I mean, how would you, in relatively simple terms, explain what non-duality is, what Advaita Vedanta is?
Yeah, well, non-duality, as the English word, typically comes from, excuse me, the tradition of Hinduism called Advaita Vedanta. There are different derivations of it. There's lots of different permutations of it now, but largely when uh, the early Americans were fortunate enough to get translations of the Upanishads, from the British Raj that had colonized India and started to translate their scriptures, and so on and so forth. And then Swami Vivekananda in 1893 comes to the Chicago Parliament of World Religions, to basically introduce Hinduism to the world. And he was firmly planted in this tradition of Advaita Vedanta. And the the word itself, Advaita, means not two. So you have Dvaita, which is two, and then which is a negative participle. So not two is literally the direct translation of Advaita. Um, and then Vedanta is essentially a combination of Veda, which are the original extant scriptures of Hinduism, like the Rig Veda, um, and then Anta, which means end. And so together it means the non-dual end of the Vedas, or the non-dual um, finality of the scriptures, you could say. And so it basically, in the name, says the import of the scriptures is non-duality, which in simple terms means that who I am in my most basic sense and who God is uh, in her most basic sense are the same who. Um, in to put it in Christian terms, Meister Eckhart, the eye with which I see God and um, the eye with which I see myself are the same eye. Um, and so there's an appearance of difference, there's an appearance of separation that's natural, that's organic, that's not problematic. However, it's only problematic if we take it as enduringly, permanently, ontologically real. And so the tradition sees this appearance of two-ness, of separation between me and you, between me and the world, between me and God, as just that, as an appearance that's not indicative of the way things really are. That's more indicative of our conditioning and the way that our finite perception is able to apprehend our experience. So we experience things in a sense of duality, but what's actually real is non-separation, non-duality.
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably not a great definition, but because you kind of have to get into the teaching itself to be able to unpack some of those things. But um, one of the scriptures that is routinely quoted in the Upanishads is Brahman, the absolute reality, is one without a second. So in terms of, a philosophical framework, it's typically described as monism, that there's only one thing. But really that's still saying too much, because you can't count God. You can't assign a number. Saying that God is one is just as wrong as saying that God is many. It's a category error. And so Advaita Vedanta and non-duality really aim to show us, not just conceptually, but directly in our own experience, um, complete non-separation from the divine.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, right. It may be a simple way to state it, maybe even oversimplification is, that we're all one with one another, one with God, right? Um, because in some ways I don't know, I think maybe I've developed a little bit of like an obsession with trying to make things accessible, you know?
Mm.
In this day and age, it seems like, there's a time I think for really going deep and, you can only simplify so much before it becomes maybe problematic oversimplification. But I think there's a need to really make some of this stuff really accessible, right? Like, how would you explain it? I think about that in the back of my mind a lot. Like, how would I explain these things to my kids, to a 5-year-old, right? That in some ways, some of the most powerful ideas, they can be expressed in those terms. And I guess powerful in the sense of like, if it's really going to reach people, if it's really going to sink in deep. And now with so many ideas floating out there, right? It's almost like Yeah, maybe it's not always going to be realistic or doable to break things down that simply, but I just like aiming for that, you know? Uh, I mean, yeah, I think you find that expressed, in scripture in different places, right? Kind of what's the sum of all the law and the prophets, right? Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. There's kind of a beautiful simplicity to that. Zen is a masterful at just kind of direct pointing, right? But not to get off topic, but like I like Alan Watts, right? I know you're familiar with Alan Watts, and I think I heard he's probably the first where I heard this idea of non-duality explained. That kind of like you were saying that okay, we could say it's all reality is one, God is one, but one has an opposite, right? That there, like you said, it's that's already saying too much or not enough. Um, that it doesn't quite capture the reality. So, okay, let's call it non dual, not two. And you could say, as he pointed out, that that also has an opposite. The opposite of non dual is dual. But the way he explained it was that this term non dual is used specially to designate this kind of label of reality or God that is beyond all labels, if that makes sense. You know?
Say the last part again.
Just like that. So if we talk about God as one, like you said, or many, there are limitations to describing God in that way, right? And so the idea that Alan Watts said is that the term non-dual would be used in a special way, special, like only to refer to this transcendent nature of reality, because obviously non-dual also has an opposite, the dual, right? So, but
Mhm.
it's a specially used term. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And see, it's tough because um, Alan Watts, I love Alan Watts, but he talked about when Zen came over, from Japan, that it was, he literally said, like, stripped for export, so like, um tying back to what you were saying about the simplifying of things, that has enabled Zen to like catch on so much in this country. In fact, Zen, was one of the first traditions outside of Christianity that really drew me into it. It was Taekwondo Soho's The Unfettered Mind. It's this teeny little book, um, but it's beautiful meditation instruction. And I would take it and literally go out into the forest behind my house and just sit and read it and just be amazed at the stillness of mind that could come with reading, the Zen texts. And um, but the whole idea of Zen coming over and being stripped for export allowed it to catch on, but it also, in some ways, made it conceptually barren. Like, we in this country were so, we had such trauma and baggage from centuries of conceptual elaboration of theology and so forth, that something new, something fresh, something that didn't have that baggage was able to cut through to us in a good way. But now that it's been here for some time, and now that there's, um, it's evolved in some way, I can see that, like, the bare bones traditions of, like, neo Advaita, or um, the bare bones, non-duality of certain thinkers, works for some people. And then some people it can be really unhelpful for, because, when these traditions were in their original context, be that Advaita Vedanta, or Dzogchen, or Zen, or Chan, or Korean Zen, the traditions themselves aren't as simplified as they come to us. They come to us, like Alan Watts said, stripped for export. And in their original context, they're surrounded by all of these explanatory and conciliatory um, teachings and practices that allow one to enter the teaching from a very accessible level and then build up to the heights of Zen non-practice or non-meditation or those kinds of things. And so like us as Americans that are, you know, completely overstimulated, overconsumerized, like bogged down with political propaganda and government intervention and all of these things that make us so wound up, and then we encounter something like Zen or non-meditation, and it sounds really great and it might be a really cool interest to us for a while, but our energetic body can't really sustain that kind of practice for very long because there's not the supports around it that are apparent in the original tradition. And so because of that, I think a lot of these concepts like non-duality can sometimes get co-opted by, I guess, maybe more egoic tendencies. And so a lot of times with that, what I see is people saying, well, non-duality is um, completely negative and negating of duality. And in a certain sense, that's true. But in another sense, non-duality is really encompassing of duality as well. It's not only
Right.
non-dual, but it's also non-dual from duality itself. And so it's a category that's, like you said, special and all on its own. Um, and that's difficult to convey a lot of times without um, going more deeply, I think, into a tradition and really practicing it as a practitioner and not just someone trying to find out a cool philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a legitimate concern, that I've heard in other places as well. Like, this nuance is important. It's like trying to understand the context of the Bible, right? There's
Yeah.
so much. And at the same time, it's yeah, I'm not really sure what the best way to deal with all that is, because I feel like what's gonna happen anyway is this strept for export thing. It's like we see it happening in Scripture, in the Gospels, in the New Testament, and as well as the Old. I mean, or the Hebrew Scriptures. It's like people, it's like the debates about circumcision, right? And the early disciples debating their dietary restrictions and who's allowed to be in our group or not. Do they have to be Jewish first before they can become Christian or not? And now it's like those are just non-issues, right? But for them, it's like, is something going to be lost, right? If we go this route, and adapt the faith to welcome Gentiles into this. And so to me, it's like it's a constantly evolving thing that it's not going to be what it was. It's going to change, right? And when you put
Yeah.
it into a new context, it's going to shift. It's not going to be exactly the same thing. But it's sort of like it's an evolutionary process, right? And the things that
Mm.
no longer that people don't find value in is just kind of often just lost, right? I don't know, for better or for worse, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. I do think there's uh, that's something definitely see in Christian thought is this, Teilhardian kind of like evolutionary perspective. Um, and it is true that, that there is constant change. I mean, that's part of samsara, this idea that there's continual uh, flux and flow and that nothing is permanent. That's a crucial element of most Eastern religions. Um, but I think what makes me pause is that even if something changes, I think it's important to, even if those may be more accessible resources um, don't get translated over, that we create new ones, that we develop our own um, resources to make the teaching accessible. Kind of like what you were saying earlier, is that, we can't just um, say, here's the highest teaching, and if you don't get it, sucks for you. There still has to be this conciliatory um, provision of resources for everyone, because not everyone's going to be able to read the Upanishads, under a teacher, and even if they can, not everyone's going to be able to get it. Some people actually have to like do 100,000 prostrations and put their face on the carpet, to actually get to what the Upanishads are pointing to. And so it's important that we have, even if not prostrations themselves, but some type of mechanism or interface with which we can engage with the tradition or a teaching in a manner of devotion and dedication, that's not so, I think, consumer oriented. That's not oriented to like, well, what's the highest teaching? Let me get that, and let me go get to this teacher, and let me get this teaching, and let me, read this book because this is even a higher teaching than this. And I think that mentality is very prevalent a lot of times in non-dual spaces. And you get a lot of, my guru calls it non-dual data wars, where people argue on about non-duality on the internet. And when it's clear that, I think if any realization uh was apparent, that wouldn't happen. Sages that realize non-duality, that realize their non-duality from the Godhead, don't argue with people on the internet. It's just not an efficient use of their time.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, it's like yeah, and that's I don't know. It's like it makes me think, I guess I'm coming from a little bit of a maybe different context, but it's connected to this consumer idea in a way. Um as a therapist, right? I'm always teaching people mindfulness practice and how to meditate, right? But it's a secular clinical context. I'm not mentioning Buddhism or Zen unless people are kind of explicitly, I know that they're open to that. Then we can have conversations about that, right? But basically, I'm telling them here is, basically how to practice mindfulness meditation and different things, that's been studied scientifically, right? To see, is this good for your mental health and that kind of thing? How do you do this? What does it involve? And it's kind of stripped. It's stripped of all of the religious and spiritual stuff, right? And yet, it's alleviating suffering. It's. I could see people are thanking me for teaching them this stuff, right? It has real value to them, not as an idea, but as a practical tool, and it's been stripped down, right? But the core and essence of the usefulness is there. Do I wish that maybe more people are open to, okay, let's go beyond just symptom relief and talk about, the real depth psychology of like what's the worldview? What's your identity in relationship to the universe and to other beings, right? To get a little bit more philosophical and that kind of thing. But a lot of people aren't looking for that, right? So I don't know what the answer is there, or how you gauge that, or, but like, I don't know. It just makes me wonder if like, would Jesus care, right? If his parables were used or not, or would he just want to show a person compassion? It's kind of like that sort of thing comes to mind. You know what I mean?
Yeah, one of the things that I like to tie in is Malcolm X had this concept that he liked to use called a diversity of tactics. Um, and so it's basically a kind of similar to, the Buddhist, like, efficient means. You're using the means that are most efficient in a particular context to um, relate to your environment, your immediate environment, whether that's a person or, or not, in a way that's compassionate, in a way that's um, life-giving, in a way that doesn't adhere specifically to um, the way that we think things should be, or a dogma, or a kind of more rigid or constrictive mindset, but it's actually a way of interfacing with the world that comes from a posture of openness. Um, and so there's there's a difference between that, I think, and like um, what our modern culture might call relativism. It doesn't mean that anything is anything and anything is as good as anything else. Um, there are gradations of, I think, value. But I think when we relate to the world in a posture of openness, the right course of action kind of presents itself to us. The right course of action becomes apparent, dependent upon our listening capacity, depending on how closely we are listening to God in that moment. Um, and so, you know, uh, I'm not sure if you're familiar with James Lowe. He's a Buddhist Dzogchen Lama and also a clinical psychotherapist, and he kind of will routinely shift between paradigms, in 3 or 4 times in a sentence. Um, but he highlights the fact that these are different tools, these are different modalities, they have different purposes, they're not appropriate to be used in the same scenario. Like it's not always appropriate to use Dzogchen when you're, in a therapy session, setting,
Right.
and it's not necessarily appropriate to use therapeutic modalities when you're, in a Dzogchen Buddhist setting. Like they're in a way conflicting in some aspects, and so the way that we approach our experience and what tools we use to interface with reality are dependent upon what's necessary in the moment. So remaining flexible and open to what's necessary in the moment, I think, is definitely part of being both a practitioner um, of a tradition of any sort, and practicing yourself, because we might be consumed with the idea of like mindfulness teaching or whatever, but the person we talk to might need a meal, you know? And so, um, I like to say like to the to the to the hungry, God is bread,
Hmm.
and to the full, bread is God. That's the essence of the Eucharist, of communion. Um, and so all of these overlapping ways of being are, in a sense, not in conflict with each other, but it doesn't mean that they can be all applied equilaterally. We need a diversity, I think, of expressions of non-duality, not just one.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, you mentioned, yeah, God being bread and listening to God. Maybe that's a good segue. It's kind of a question that I had for you because I don't talk to a whole lot of non-duality people, and despite what you might imagine, my question is like, in your mind or in your heart, do you relate to God more in a personal way or more impersonally? Like, do you lean one way or the other? I mean, maybe we could say, right, non-dually, God maybe transcends the concepts of personal or impersonal. But I don't know. What would you say? I mean, for you, is God personal or more impersonal?
I'd say yes. Um, and that's both my experience and then also um, contiguous with the Advaita tradition proper of classical Advaita, is that there's ultimately, if you really held a the head swami of the Ramakrishna mission or the Chinmaya mission or whatever, if you really held them to a wall and said, you know, is God personal or impersonal? They might say, well, ultimately, in the tradition, the higher view technically is impersonal. Um, but that's a pedagogical division that's made. It's not a division that's true to reality. So even our categories of how we talk about these things are conceptual. So ultimately, whether we divide the being of God into personal or impersonal, it's still a conceptual division that's only applicable within our finite understanding. And so, in a sense, in our experience, God can be experienced personally. I mean, you can't look at the thousands of years of religious tradition across the planet, and that's just what we know about, and say that God cannot be experienced personally because it's obvious. It's right there. There's countless people who talk about experiencing God personally. So unless you think that there's some, conspiracy over millennia to fool you personally, then it's just absurd and preposterous to think that God cannot be experienced personally. But then also there's equally sufficient examples of God being experienced impersonally, as far as the nature of mind and the ground of being, as Meister Eckhart puts it. He says, "God, I pray thee, rid me of God." And so there's precedent, you know, uh, all over, East and West, both organized religion and indigenous traditions of both aspects of personal and impersonal. Um, but then, in a certain sense, that's all conceptual language that's put onto an experience that's indescribable, that can't be described as either personal or impersonal, or both or neither. Um, and so I think we can use those categories to try and maybe grope our way around the elephant, so to speak, to use the old metaphor. Um, but again, at the end of the day, we have to recognize that they're concepts, and that God is not a conceptual reality that's able to be apprehended by our minds. Not that it's not worth trying, because that's part of that's I've heard people say that's what theology is. It's the exercise of thought as spiritual practice. It's the exercise of the mind, faith seeking understanding, is how it's traditionally put. And so we can use those categories to try and understand as part of our spiritual practice. But we shouldn't mistake our spiritual practice for the God that our spiritual practice is about, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that resonates, Um, yeah, it's God is always going to transcend those categories, and yeah, it comes down to how are we going to experience God? And you know, to me, that's part of the power of this kind of spirituality. This kind of, almost you could say, spirituality of incarnation. That's what it is to me. It's like, it's not finding God. I think you even said in the book, right? It's like, or maybe you were quoting somebody else in the book, that you don't look elsewhere to find God or find God in the sky, but you look within. You look here, right? That God is immanent and present here, and that's an idea that resonates, I think. And to me, that's kind of what non-duality points to, a non-separation. I'm kind of
Yeah.
curious because I had that recently, Thomas J. Ord on my podcast. And I think there's a lot of interesting overlap. I think the way he thinks about certain things can be very helpful for kind of getting some grasp or interesting ways to think about God and make God more accessible. And yet, right, I know there's some very clear differences. Like, he's definitely not sort of in the non-dual camp, I don't think, in terms of like, we talked about this, and he's like, I'm not going for that, because then I would have to say that Trump is God, and I don't want to do that, right? And in my head, I'm kind of thinking, well, Trump is God, and from a certain perspective, right? I mean, maybe not the ego of Trump, right? But I don't know. How would you respond to that?
Well, first, I love Tom. Tom's probably one of my favorite people in, the Christian space because, I come from the Christian space originally, like I grew up in the Methodist Church and the non-denominational church later. And, um, my first really profound, religious conversion experience, I guess you could say, in my adult life was reading the Bhagavad Gita and seeing Christ through the teaching of Krishna. And so my first copy of the Gita is marked up in all the margins with scriptural annotation, because I would have the Bible and have the Gita both out and be flipping through them both, and kind of um, just really amazed at the harmony and the resonance between them. Um,
If only more people
and
could understand that feeling, right?
and a lot of times because of that, I'm kind of maybe perceived as being too Christian for the non-dual, Buddhist kind of crowd, and then also a little too Eastern influenced for the Christian crowd. And so I kind of I'm in this like liminal space, I think, to people. But Tom Ord is never someone who has otherized anyone, including me. He's a very open person, and I think regardless of whether his theology is, agreeable to me, I think that's besides the point. I think the way that he lives is indicative of um, his theology, and so that's what I think is worthy of comparison. Is how our theology is lived in how we treat people. Um, and so anyway, but it in terms of the idea of God as personal in the sense of, Donald Trump, like you said, I think the way that Advaita Vedanta frames it is there's a teaching statement in the Upanishads, um, called uh, a Mahavakya, a great saying, and one of them, of the four major ones, is Tattvamasi, thou art that. And there's a whole commentarial tradition around this one little teeny snippet of a verse, of a mantra, um, and because there's so much rejection around it. There's the dualist schools of Vedanta, the schools of Vedanta that say no, God and man are separate, and they are never to overlap or to touch, or they're completely at opposite ends of the ontological spectrum. And they use this verse to say, well, that's not what they mean. And so the tradition of Advaita has this explanatory um, elaboration to say what is non-essential in both God and what is non-essential in me needs to be abstracted out in order for the statement to not be self-contradictory. So it's not saying that God, as in the personal sense of an infinite being, ontotheology. It's not saying that God, the personal God, the one that Tom Ward might be familiar with, is the same as me, the person. Um, to read Advaita Vedanta in that way is to misunderstand it. Um, the more accurate way to understand it is to say that what is essential to me and what is essential to God are the same essence, and that's abstracted from the finite conditions of my body and the finite conditions of my mind and of my environment.
Mhm.
Um, what is essential to me essentially is pure, unalloyed awareness, which is indistinguishable from pure, unalloyed being, which is also indistinguishable from pure, unalloyed bliss or non-suffering. And so that is the essential component of both me as an embodied person and the essential being of God. And so God is associated with the entire universe. The personal sense of God is associated with the entire universe. And I'm associated as a person with this limited body. But when both God and I are disassociated from the universe and the finite expression of that universe, then what is essential to both is the same fundamental thing, which is not a thing, but sometimes we talk about it that way.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation. I like to use the images. I don't know if this is on the right track, but it's kind of like consciousness. God is the fire, the blazing fire, and we're kind of like the sparks. That spark of consciousness is within us. Or like Thich Nhat Hanh and many others have used this image of the wave as as they call it, the historical or individual dimension, and but the ocean is the ultimate dimension, right? And that it's really the mind that kind of separates out and says, okay, this wave is different from that wave. And I mean, yes, there is multiplicity, right? There is diversity, but in essence, right, the wave is the ocean, that kind of thing. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's so both of those examples, the sparks and the flame and the ocean and its waves actually do originate in the Upanishads. And again, the commentary around them um, serves to explain them in a way where the fire and the sparks kind of acts as like a provisional understanding that you know the sparks kind of fly off of the flame, and so they appear as separate, even though they're really the energetic manifestations of the fire. And so the later tradition kind of subtilizes that even further and says instead of fire and sparks, it's like fire and its power of warmth, fire and its warmth itself, which are they cannot occupy two spaces at all. They are conceptually indeterminate. Or with the wave in the ocean, you know, um, the tradition would say the wave is different from the ocean because the ocean is the collection, the totality of all of the waves. They are, in a certain sense, part and whole. So they are um, the tradition of Vishishta Advaita uses this example of the wave in the ocean because the waves are parts of the ocean. They are contained within the ocean. Um, and so that's more akin to like the panentheistic kind of description of reality. But Advaita kind of takes it a little in a different direction and says, well, the ocean and the wave are different because one is associated with the totality and one is associated with a finite part of that totality. But extrapolated from the finiteness and the infiniteness, what is the same is water. So it's the water that is representative of Brahman or of pure consciousness or of um, the absolute that's present both in us as the individual wave and the ocean as a collection of waves. And I think that might seem like, splitting hairs, but I think in the tradition, it's important because what it does is allows us to retain devotion. It allows us to recognize non-duality, but not brush aside duality. It allows us to retain the ability for the wave and the ocean to have a devotional and life-giving relationship, and for novelty and freshness and compassion to manifest in that realm without there being any kind of hard line division.
I think that's a very important point because I've struggled with that a little bit as I've, been more exposed with Buddhism, non-duality, all this stuff. It's like it becomes a little bit more difficult to retain that sense of God as personal, other, right? Um, and I do think it's important to see both, and I appreciate Tom because he's helped me to kind of try to retain that sense of otherness, which is kind of necessary and important in a way, right? To have that relationship. You can't really have a relationship with if there's no sense of otherness whatsoever, which is kind of interesting because it's like, as you were talking to me, there's some, from a certain perspective, it almost seems obvious to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but it's like, of course we're God. How could God create something that is not God, right? Um, and but it's like, yeah, that separation is some way it's important, right? It's for there to be a kind of genuine experience of relationship, of love. Um, you know, I don't know if you've there's a new show out called Pluribus. Have you seen that at all? It's on Apple TV, I think.
I've seen the ads for it, but I've not watched it now.
Yeah, I don't know. We don't have to get into it. I'm just going to touch on how it raises some really interesting, I think, philosophical questions. And it's written by and directed or whatever by the same guy, Vince Gilligan, who did Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, right? But it's a very different but very unique story. There's like a type of virus that breaks out, which essentially makes every single person on the planet into a hive mind. So
Hmm.
they're all effectively one. So, and every single person on the planet is infected with this except for like 11 people on the entire planet. And it centers on this one woman. So she's not one with everybody, right? And then everyone else is completely in sync. So if she's talking to one individual, she's simultaneously talking to every single individual on the planet. They all have shared consciousness, shared knowledge of everything. Anyway, I don't
Hmm.
know.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's really wild
Yeah.
because she's just like they want her to join, right? They're trying to figure out, okay, why is she immune? We have to fix that. And she's like, no, I don't want to join. I want to retain my individuality. Y'all are a cult. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Anyway, it's
Hmm.
kind of off topic, but it raises some interesting questions about sameness, otherness, oneness. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, the Christian tradition definitely places a premium on otherness. That's the
mm,
whole idea of, post-liberal theology and Emmanuel Levinas, the eruption of the religious other is what creates the draw of us, the magnetic pull towards, the erotic and or even the agapeic, the religious other is what creates this dynamism. Um, and I think that's present in other traditions, but it's maybe less emphasized. And so it's more a difference in emphasis. Like what comes to mind is the Ramana Maharshi quote where, they ask him, how should we treat others? And he says, there are none. He says, there are no others.
yeah,
And
I
and
heard
what
that. I
he
love that.
what he's referencing is that, you know, um, really like the name of your podcast, the sacred thread. There's a line in the Bhagavad Gita that where Krishna, who's basically the absolute personified, is speaking to his friend Arjuna, and he says, you know, um, all of these beings that you see are strung on me like a thread, like a mani sutri. And so he's the thread that threads through every being. And so in that sense, there are no others because it is the same God that's looking out of every face. Um, and so there is difference, but there is a unity, and not in a sense of a sameness, not in a homogenized sense, but a um, indescribable oneness non-numeric, to go back to our original point that it's not oneness in abstraction from manyness. It's oneness in harmony with manyness. And I think that's the difference between maybe like the hive mind mentality of everyone being the same and everything appearing many, but being an unfolding and a blooming of one.
Hmm. Yeah, fascinating. Well, well, thanks for Jory for this conversation. I know that we're pretty much at our time for today, but yeah, it's really good to connect with like mind and someone else who's interested in these kind of topics. Yeah, so for those of you who are listening, Becoming All Light, check it out. Great book so far that I'm reading. And I don't know, anything else that you wanted to share? I'm sure I can link to where people maybe can find you on social media and that kind of thing. But anything you want to share or not really?
Yeah, I mean, you can put the website on the podcast notes. I've got a contact form there. I do informal spiritual direction. So if anyone just really wants to talk about God and how God's showing up in their life or not showing up, and or need resources, or maybe just want to um, talk about struggles, it's really an open format, open door kind of way of relating that I try to offer to people. That I think in the spiritual space there's so much consumerized packaging of spirituality, um, and I've never enjoyed that, and so I try to just offer a space where you don't have to buy anything, you don't have to pay for a course, you don't have to sign up for an email list, you don't have to join anyone's Patreon, you don't have to like and subscribe, and all of that stuff. I mean, that's fine, but I think sometimes just having someone who's also walking the path to walk alongside you is important. It's something that's benefited me personally, in receiving that, but then also benefited me in terms of sitting with people as well. So that's just something I like to offer as well.
Cool. Yeah. Well, that sounds awesome, Jory. Yeah, I'll try to share all that information, and when this comes out, and for those who are interested. So, well, thanks again for, like I said, a great conversation, Jory, and thanks everyone out there for listening. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.